The stories that intrigue us most from our past are often the bloodiest and most horrific.
Names like Vlad the Impaler, Richard III and Attila the Hun have an almost mythical status. And we remain fascinated by the dark deeds of Roman emperors and rampaging Vikings.
But it's easy to forget that these people and their victims were real.
And that the facts are usually more complicated than the bloody tale.
I'm Joe Crowley, journalist and investigator.
And I'm Dr. Susanna Lipscomb, historian and author.
Together, we're going to discover the secret stories behind history's most infamous characters and events.
Looking again at history's crime scenes. So this is it, this is case closed.
Hunting down evidence.
Wow, so look at these. So these are the proof.
And coming to some very surprising conclusions.
Think you know history's bloodiest tales?
Time to think again.
In this episode, we investigate 3 of history's most mysterious cold cases.
Attila the Hun, legendary warrior king, found dead the morning after his wedding.
I think Attila was murdered, and I think that was a plot that was hatched right here in Constantinople.
The princes in the Tower of London, vanished, presumed murdered by King Richard III.
It seems extremely likely that they have been put to death.
And medieval noble Juan Borgia, victim of a mafia-style hit that helped inspire The Godfather.
Acts of violence required retaliations, bloody retaliations.
It's the wedding night of near-mythical warrior king Attila the Hun, arch-enemy of the Roman Empire. His new bride is Ildiko, said by Roman chroniclers to be a great beauty. To celebrate, Attila feasts deep into the night, sharing toasts with his fellow Huns before retiring to bed. But the next morning, Attila does not emerge. When his anxious bodyguards burst in, they find his lifeless body and blood on the sheets. Who or what could have killed the most feared man on earth?
Attila's tribe, the Huns, arrived in Europe around 3 decades before Attila's birth. They came from the east and settled on the Great Hungarian Plain, just beyond the reach of the Roman Empire. I want to find out more about the Huns and their enemies. To help me on my quest, I've enlisted archaeologist Professor Barry Cunliffe.
Barry, hello, Joe.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
So just what happened when the Huns hit these plains 1,600 years ago?
The Huns established themselves as the bosses of a whole range of different people, and they make sure that these people are kept subservient.
So how is that possible? What is it about the Huns that made them so fearsome?
I think it really boils down to the man-horse relationship. If you can imagine the power of one horse, imagine 1,000 or 1,500 out there just coming towards you. A perfectly tuned engine that is just bent on your destruction.
The Huns used their unmatched horsemanship and archery to create a vast empire. Then in 434 AD, Attila succeeded to the Hunnic throne.
Attila comes in at that point when the whole Hunnic body is working as one, and he is the big man who is able to control the lot.
Just how powerful a leader was he?
For 20 years or so, he was probably the dominant character in the whole of Europe.
As the Huns grew ever more powerful, the Romans were in decline. Their empire was now split in two, with the wealth centered around Constantinople to the east. It was a prime target for King Attila.
He was organising a protection racket, really. He was threatening particularly Constantinople. And if the Romans didn't pay him what he asked, he would simply attack.
Attila was a constant threat and a massive drain on Roman resources, costing their treasury over 10 tons of gold in payoffs. Much of this gold was melted down for Hunnic jewelry. But today, the Hungarian National Museum hold coins which make the Roman source clear.
Wow, so look at these. So these are the proof, the evidence of the fear and the respect that Attila instilled in the mighty Roman Empire.
This coin hoard was found in Szikancs. It's in the Great Plain in Hungary.
Right.
And the total number was around 2,000 coins in one hoard. And we know it was minted under the rule of Theodosius II.
So this definitely dates it to the time of Attila.
Yes, to the time of Attila.
And this would have been, what do you call it, a tribute, a ransom? We pay you now so you don't attack later?
It was called a tribute.
Tribute. And this was an attempt to keep them away from Constantinople, to keep them away from the Roman Empire. Amazing.
The once mighty Roman Empire was paying golden tribute to a barbarian king. Could there have been any greater motivation to kill Attila the Hun?
As Joe's learned, the Romans must have desperately wanted Attila dead. But one person had a far greater opportunity to kill the king on his wedding night: his bride.
So I think the finger of suspicion must first of all point at Ildiko. She was the last to see him alive and the first to be found with his dead body. But what evidence links her to his death?
To find out, I've come to one of Europe's oldest libraries, the Bodleian. A treasure trove of texts from the ancient world. Here, historian Dr. Megan McAvoy showed me a 1,500-year-old document that points the finger squarely at Ildiko.
This is actually the chronicle of a man we know as Marcellinus Comes. It's written about 80 years after Attila's death.
So what does it say?
Well, it says that Attila, the king of the Huns and the ravager of Europe, was killed on his wedding night by a knife wielded by his wife.
Aha, so this is it. This is case closed. It was her.
Well, it's not as straightforward as that. You know, this was a source written 80 years after the events. We're not at all sure what Marcellinus's sources are. He's writing in Constantinople, a long way away from the events.
So he's separated by time and place, and maybe therefore not very reliable as a source.
Potentially. I mean, in fact, he even gets the year of Attila's death wrong.
Well, that's not a good sign, is it?
It's not really.
The case against Ildiko seems fatally flawed. But the Bodleian does hold another document describing Attila's death. A copy of a work written by a Roman historian named Priscus.
Priscus is singularly well informed about the Huns. He has been on an embassy himself to Attila.
So he actually met Attila?
He has met him. He can give us the only eyewitness account we have of Attila.
This meeting came 4 years before Attila's ill-fated wedding. Priscus was hundreds of miles away when Attila died, but news still appears to have reached him of how the king met his end.
On the actual night of the wedding, he gives himself over greatly, we're told, to wine and to merriment. At the end of the evening, we're told that he lies down on his back, sodden with drunkenness, and he actually has a hemorrhage.
According to Priscus, It wasn't the Romans who caused Attila's sudden death, but booze. He simply got a nosebleed and was too drunk to wake up.
Nearly 1600 years ago, this city was known as Constantinople. It was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire and the place where Priscus penned his tale of Attila's death. Now, the fact that Priscus wrote of Attila's death right here in this great city, over 1,000 kilometers from the action, well, of course, that should make us cautious. But one historian goes even further. He says that Priscus's account that Attila died of natural causes after heavy drinking was deliberately false. In fact, he says it was part of a massive cover-up. To hear about the conspiracy in Constantinople, I'm heading to the old part of town. I've been invited there for a drink by historian Dr. Michael Babcock.
Michael, good to see you. How are you?
Good to see you too.
Joe. So Michael, what's with the red wine? It seems slightly ironic to sit here and talk about Attila the Hun with the very drink that probably killed him.
Well, many people did toast his death when he died, but the wine is something that takes us right back, as close as we can get to the night he died. He died, we are told, on his wedding night, and that was the occasion of a great feast, and there was drinking at that feast. But what Priscus, the eyewitness historian, tells us in an earlier visit when he was there is that Attila drank relatively little. He was a man who was very much in charge of himself, in control of himself, and drinking was not very high on the list of his occupations.
So where does this story of the barbarian dying a drunken death come from then?
Well, we're right here in the old city of Constantinople, and that's where the story would have originated.
Today, the skyline of Istanbul is punctured by mosques. But in the 5th century, this was a Christian city. Attila's drunken death fitted their idea of how a heathen should die.
The picture of him as a drunken glutton came from the pulpits of the churches of this city.
So this is Christian Roman PR spin in action.
Oh, exactly right. It was part of the political and religious propaganda that emanated from the church and from the palace of this city.
If you're concerned that this drunken death really doesn't add up, what do you think happened?
Well, I think Attila was murdered. And I think that was a plot that was hatched once again right here in Constantinople.
According to Michael, the murder was motivated by fear. And Attila clearly terrified the people here. These great city walls were specifically built to keep out the Huns. But building walls is one thing, killing the leader of a superpower, quite another. So how would it actually work? How would they assassinate Attila the Hun hundreds of miles from here?
Today, if you want to kill your enemy in the home camp, what you do is you send out a laser-guided missile. And that's how you do it. But back then, ambassadors who traveled from court to court were as good as a laser-guided missile.
Attila's ambassadors often visited the court in Constantinople. Michael thinks they were bribed to go back and murder their leader. It seems to be agreed there was no wound upon the body, so what happened to kill Attila the Hun?
The most likely thing that would have happened would have been poisoning, certainly. He wasn't himself a drinker, but there were ceremonial toasts that he would have sipped. And certainly he could have been poisoned on that night.
So, could it be that Attila didn't die of drunkenness, but was taken out by a 5th century drone, fired from Constantinople?
The assassination theory is intriguing, but is it the likeliest cause of death? To try and answer that question, I'm meeting forensic pathologist Dr. Stuart Hamilton.
Good to see you again.
Hello. If you're just going to white coat and some overshoes.
Right, okay.
It's his job to determine what causes sudden deaths. So what would he make of finding Attila the Hun on his mortuary slab?
Okay, so Attila here, he was found with blood coming from his nose and down his throat. Does that suggest to you that he could have been murdered?
If there's no other signs of trauma, it doesn't really sound like a typical murder, but I suppose you can't exclude poisoning. But in those sort of situations, you'd really expect to see more generalised bleeding rather than just sort of one focal area.
If poisoning doesn't fit the evidence, what about alcohol?
As a forensic pathologist, context is key. What we've got is Attila, who, as I understand, was maybe 50, in his 50s. It's his wedding night, and he's had quite a bit to drink. On a wedding night, I think we can assume that he's maybe exerted himself a little more than normal. That puts your blood pressure up, it puts your pulse up, and that sort of thing can cause a nosebleed. But if you're dead drunk and you've lost your gag reflex, blood runs down back of your throat, into your airways, blocks them, you asphyxiate. The simplest explanation for a pathologist is often the most likely.
So you're telling me that what killed Attila was sex?
More by sex and alcohol.
The simplest forensic solution fits our best historical record. Both suggest Attila, the most feared warrior on earth, was killed not by the Romans, but by a killer combination of wine and overexertion on his wedding night.
It seems to me that we want the great exciting figures from the past to have died great exciting deaths. Yet these mythical figures were real, and they died in real, if sometimes embarrassing ways.
At the Tower of London, two boys are put to bed. 12-year-old Edward recently deposed King of England and his 9-year-old brother. The pair have been sent here for safekeeping, but they couldn't be in greater danger. Tonight, the boys will be murdered on the orders of the new king, their uncle, Richard III.
At least, that's the famous story immortalised by William Shakespeare. But is it true? With no trial, no witnesses, and no confirmed bodies found, this remains one of history's greatest mysteries. How did two princes vanish from England's most impregnable fortress? The Tower of London.
The prime suspect in this cold case is undoubtedly Richard III. Long considered the arch-villain of English history.
The thing about Richard III is our understanding, the public imagination of what he was really like, isn't really shaped by historical sources, but by Shakespeare's retelling of the story. It's not hard to see why.
His play, Richard III, is still box office, 500 years after the king's death. But its portrayal of Richard as a tyrant and child killer is not popular with everyone.
Phil, good to see you. How are you?
Fine, and yourself?
Very good, thank you.
Phil Stone is chairman of the Richard III Society, a group dedicated to clearing Richard's name.
Phil, Richard III, the play has great reviews. What's your problem with Shakespeare?
It's not history. It's a great play. It's very interesting, but it's not history. Shakespeare was writing for his time.
So what is it that Shakespeare covers here that you're not happy with?
Most productions give Richard the Hunchback. He was a fighting man. No fighting man would have been the general that he was if he was crook-backed, as Shakespeare would have him.
A sensational archaeological dig in 2012 unearthed what is believed to be the skeleton of Richard III. The dramatic find made headlines around the world and suggested that Richard's disability had been greatly exaggerated. This warrior king did have a curved spine, but he was not Shakespeare's hunchback.
So why give him these deformities?
A deformed body was the sign of a deformed mind. So blacken him physically, you're blackening his character.
It's now clear that Shakespeare's play slanders Richard, yet his most explosive claim that Richard killed his nephews still seems to add up. In 1483, Richard had grabbed the throne from the elder nephew Edward V, claiming the young king was illegitimate. Richard also executed Edward's leading advisors and sent him and his brother to the Tower, where they conveniently vanished.
What about the princes in the Tower? They were under his care. Surely it's obvious that Richard III had them killed.
Yes, he took them into custody, put them in the Tower for their protection. They were declared bastards, and yes, they were never seen in public again. But just because they disappeared doesn't mean to say they're dead. If they're dead, it doesn't mean to say Richard was responsible. If you take the historical documents that are available from the time, it doesn't all add up.
I've got a lot of time for what Phil says. In many ways, it's actually quite lazy just to accept the Shakespeare version when there are many other possibilities and explanations out there. Just as we wouldn't trust Hollywood today to give us an accurate picture of a historical event, so too we should be cautious with Shakespeare. What we really need to do now is get back to the earliest sources.
The prince's disappearance is mysterious precisely because there is no smoking gun. But there are clues, and some of the most intriguing are in here. This is the headquarters of heraldry in England. Founded by Richard III himself, it's an Aladdin's cave of precious documents. This 7-metre-long roll records the history of Richard's wife's family. So does Richard's entry blame him for the prince's death? Not exactly. It just says Richard III, King of England, and refers to him as an ill-starred husband, a husband who has brought bad luck to his wife. However, another chronicle from the time looks more revealing. This document was produced by a Londoner, and it tells the story of the last years of the 15th century. The year 1482-1483 is a long entry, and it has this crucial line for our case at the end. Item this year, King Edward IV's sons, so we know who they are, the princes in the Tower, were put to death in the Tower of London. And who by? It says to the vise of, in other words, on the advice of, or by the device of, the Duke of Buckingham. Here is a new suspect, Buckingham, a prominent noble. Could he have arranged the murder to ease his own path to the crown? Or even on behalf of Richard? This document is tantalising. But what it isn't is an account of an eyewitness. This is to some extent based on hearsay, and therefore it's not enough to prove a case against the Duke of Buckingham. Other gossip from the time does blame Richard. Clearly, even in 1483, the prince's disappearance was a sensational mystery. Yet someone must have known the secret.
2 years after the princes vanished, King Richard III was preparing for an era-defining fight. Here in 1485, Richard would become the last English king to die in battle. It was the day when his Plantagenet dynasty ended and the Tudor dynasty began.
I've come to Bosworth Field, but not to find out about the battle itself. Instead, I'm here to learn about the night before, because one historian has a theory about that night which, if true, completely destroys this idea of Richard III as the killer of the young princes.
Historian David Baldwin believes that 2 years after the boys vanished, the younger prince was still alive, and right here in Richard's camp.
I think they had to be preserved alive, but of course, equally, they would have to be hidden away. And it seems to me that this is what happened to Prince Richard.
So almost like a modern day, I don't know, FBI relocation program. You sort of think they were put undercover somewhere.
Yes.
And what evidence is there for this theory?
Well, the one piece of hard evidence, I suppose, we have is that someone called Richard Plantagenet died at Eastwell in Kent in 1550.
At Eastwell, the parish register recorded the death of one Richard Plantagenet, the same rare and royal name as the boy who'd gone missing from the tower 67 years before. An incredible local legend suggests this prince had grown up to become a bricklayer.
He was a rather different kind of bricklayer, though, because he could read Latin, which suggested that he had been very well educated. And when pressed, he said that he was brought here to meet King Richard. And he learned the art of bricklaying to, in a sense, bury his former identity, his former life.
The bricklaying prince is an extraordinary idea, yet impossible to wholly disprove.
So that theory accounts for the younger prince, but what about the older prince?
Well, the one thing that we do know for certain about Edward V while he was in the Tower is that he was being visited by his doctor. And if he was ill, he could have died of his ailment. Or, of course, he might even have been killed by overzealous medical attention, medieval medical attention.
Don't you think that Richard III would have held up his hand and said, look, this has happened, you know, I'm very sorry for it, but it had nothing to do with me?
The problem, I think, is would anyone have believed him if he had?
According to David, not only was Richard III innocent of his nephew's murder, but the boys weren't even killed. With so many competing theories, just what should we believe?
Dozens of seductive theories have built up to explain how the princess disappeared at this incredible fortress.
But now it's time to decide which we think is the most likely. Here to help me is Tower of London curator Dr. Sally Dixon-Smith.
We know that within a month of their father's death, the eldest prince, so the heir, has been brought here to the Tower of London.
Sally took me to the reputed spot of the prince's prison.
So there's a reference to the two boys playing in a garden, and at the time, the tower just here was called the Garden Tower. The tradition built up that this was where the princes stayed. And for this reason, about 100 years after their disappearance, it becomes known as the Bloody Tower.
But should it be called the Bloody Tower? Was there even a murder? And if so, who was behind it?
If you had to put money on one of the theories, which one would you back?
I think the balance of probability is Richard III. We do know that their household and their servants were taken away from them, really at the heart of Richard's coup. And at that point, they seem to have disappeared.
Couldn't it be that they just sickened and died?
One of the last people who stays with them is their doctor. And the doctor comments on the fact that the elder prince is preparing for his death. Is this because he's ill? Or is this because everyone else is getting bumped off and he's fairly sure he's next in line?
We know Richard's deadly reputation is not all spin. He had executed his nephew's advisors when he seized the throne. So why not kill his nephews too? They were the focal point for any opposition. And they were held in his castle.
Other Other people could definitely have got into them, but I think it would be highly unlikely that they would have done anything to them or put them to death without Richard's knowledge. He is king, he is in charge. He has to have known about it or consented to it in some form.
Richard had the character to kill. He had the motive, and the Tower gave him the opportunity. I think just because Richard is the victim of Shakespeare's character assassination doesn't make him innocent. As king, he was in charge of this impregnable fortress. In other words, if they died here, he would have had to have known about it. We cannot be completely certain of the prince's fate, but one day we may learn more. At Westminster Abbey lie the remains of 2 children. They were discovered at the Tower over 300 years ago and buried as the princes. If these bodies were exhumed, it's just possible forensic science could discover if they were the princes, and if so, how they died.
In Rome's lawless ghetto, a deadly trap has been set. The prey is 22-year-old nobleman Juan Borgia. Knives are plunged into his head and torso, and his throat is slit. It's a brutal new chapter in the astonishing story of Juan's family, the Borgias. Famed for their power, violence, and decadence, they even inspired the creation of The Godfather. But these aren't exactly gangsters. Juan's father is the Pope himself. His brother, a cardinal, and Juan was commander of the papal armies. So just who would dare kill one of the all-powerful Borgias?
I want to start my detective work by going back to the scene of the crime, the back streets of Renaissance Rome. What clues can we pick up here about who killed Juan Borgia? In 1497, this city was run by Juan's father, Pope Alexander VI. A very different pope to today's model. Not just head of the church, he also ruled central Italy like a king. And despite his vows of chastity, he had numerous lovers and fathered at least 8 children. Juan had been his favorite. Now I want to retrace that favorite son's final steps. So I've enlisted the help of local historian Alicia Lerossi.
Hello, you must be Alicia.
Hello, Susie.
We met by a house said to be the scene of Juan's Last Supper.
So Juan came and had dinner with his mother? With his mother and with his brother Cesare. Late in the night, the guests left in small groups. Juan, he left with the groom, servant, despite the others that recommended him to get an armed escort.
The brothers left together. Then Juan headed for the Jewish ghetto.
It seems really quite foolish to go off into the dark night down these little back streets. I mean, why did he do it?
Juan was very arrogant. He was the son of the Pope.
Yeah, so as far as he's concerned, he's invincible.
Yeah.
Next, Juan split up from his groom. It was a bad move for both of them.
Papal guard found in this area the groom mortally wounded.
What had happened?
He had been stabbed.
And so what about Juan?
There was no news of Juan.
Juan had vanished. The next day, a very anxious Pope launched an investigation. That unearthed a boatman who had seen a body thrown into the river Tiber the night Juan disappeared.
The Pope summoned up about 300 fishermen and swimmers. On June 16th, the body of Juan was found. This is a Cinque Dea, and probably he was stabbed with this weapon, and he hadn't been robbed.
So it was clearly an assassination?
Yes, it was clearly an assassination.
The body of Juan Borgia had been dumped in the Tiber like a piece of rubbish. Who on earth had decided to take on Rome's godfather?
Organized hits, bodies flung into water. This murder has more than a hint of mafia-style war in Renaissance Rome.
From the moment Juan went missing, Rome was in uproar. No one quite knew what was going to happen next. Shops battened down their hatches and great families retreated to their fortified palaces for fear that this was just the beginning of a violent storm.
The Borgia family were expected to seek brutal revenge. But against whom?
Now this is Palazzo Sforza Cesarini. It was built by Juan Borgia's father, but when he became Pope, the powerful Sforza family moved in.
Their boss was Ascanio Sforza, once the Pope's number 2. But now the pair had fallen out. So could the head of this house be behind the killing? To find out, I'm meeting Professor Robert Black.
A couple of days before the murder, there had been a quarrel between a servant of Juan Borgia and a servant of Cardinal Ascanio Sforza. Juan Borgia's servant had been killed in this quarrel, and then Cardinal Ascanio Sforza's servant had been seized by the Borgia and hanged summarily.
So it's quite serious. I mean, there's quite a lot of retaliation
there. Quite a lot of retaliation.
Juan and Ascanio were also seen arguing violently. The Rome rumour mill made Ascanio Sforza prime suspect.
Were there other immediate suspects?
An important group were the various husbands or families of Juan Borgia's lovers. Juan Borgia wasn't much of a soldier, he wasn't much of anything, but he was a big lover.
So there's a suspicion that his playing away might have caught up with him.
That's right, but this was his principal interest in life.
For 3 days, the Pope's investigators scoured Rome, searching this palace and others for evidence. Then he called a public meeting at the Vatican.
He started going through all the people who he felt had not done the murder, including Sforza. And he went through this long list.
So he's very public about who he rules out, who he says is beyond reproach on this.
That's right. But he very pointedly did not mention the Orsini.
The Orsini family were huge regional rivals of the Borgias. They owned castles dangerously close to Rome, and just 3 years earlier had sided against the Pope in war.
He believed it was the Orsini, and I think he believed that right from the beginning.
If Robert is right, then the killing of Juan Borgia was just one more deadly episode in an ongoing turf war. Fought not by gangsters, but by noblemen, cardinals, and the Pope.
Pope Alexander never did charge anyone for the murder of his favourite son, Juan Borgia. But that's not to say he didn't know who the killers were and where they lived.
This is the former HQ of the Orsini family. Here in the year leading up to Juan's death, the Orsini was severely provoked by the Borgias. Provoked into murder, according to Professor Marco Pellegrini.
So Marco, this is a very impressive fresco. Who or what are we seeing here?
Virginio Orsini, the most important figure on horseback. He was in command of the whole region north of Rome.
From this mighty castle, the Orsini's leader dominated the area. But the Pope wanted Virginio out of the way.
Alexander VI thought that simply by beheading the Orsini family, the problem was to be solved. You eliminate the chief and you eliminate the whole family.
So what happens to Virginio?
Virginio was captured on the battlefield and he mysteriously died in jail. The general conviction was that he was killed on the order of Pope Alexander VI.
This alone sounds like a motive for the Orsini to strike at the Borgias. But there's more. Months after Virginio's death, the Pope ordered a military assault here on the Orsini stronghold. Leading the papal armies was Juan Borgia himself.
Joe, look over the edge.
Okay.
There is a sign of a cannon blow.
Oh yeah.
It must have been done between November 1496 and January 1497.
So it makes a mark,
yes,
but it doesn't break through?
No, because the wall was so tough that they would resist gunfire.
So how effective was the siege?
The siege failed, and during this battle, Juan Borgia was not only defeated, but wounded. So he had to go back to Rome, covered with shame. He proved to be absolutely nothing as a military commander.
The Orsini have motives to attack the Borgias, but this siege and this battle, that's reason to go after Juan.
Yes, he was in charge of the papal army, so he was responsible for this attack. Acts of violence required retaliations, bloody retaliations. They were provoked to death through this attack to the Bracciano castle.
The Orsini were clearly not short of reasons to strike out against the Borgias.
They wanted revenge for Virginio's death. They'd been attacked by Juan and the papal armies, and they were the closest geographical rivals. They had to strike out to protect themselves against the Pope's designs on their lands and their castle.
We can't say for sure who killed Juan Borgia, but there's a very strong case that this was an Orsini hit. The stories that intrigue us most from our past are often the bloodiest and most horrific.
Names like Vlad the Impaler, Richard III and Attila the Hun have an almost mythical status. And we remain fascinated by the dark deeds of Roman emperors and rampaging Vikings.
But it's easy to forget that these people and their victims were real.
And that the facts are usually more complicated than the bloody tale.
I'm Joe Crowley, journalist and investigator.
And I'm Dr. Susanna Lipscomb, historian and author.
Together, we're going to discover the secret stories behind history's most infamous characters and events.
Looking again at history's crime scenes.
So this is it, this is case closed.
Hunting down evidence.
Wow, so look at these. So these are the proof.
And coming to some very surprising conclusions.
Think you know history's bloodiest tales?
Time to think again.
In this episode, we investigate 3 of history's most mysterious cold cases.
Of a whole range of different people. And they make sure that these people are kept subservient.
So, how is that possible? What is it about the Huns that made them so fearsome?
I think it really boils down to the man-horse relationship. If you can imagine the power of one horse, imagine 1,000 or 1,500 out there just coming towards you. A perfectly tuned engine that is just bent on your destruction.
The Huns used their unmatched horsemanship and archery to create a vast empire. Then, in 434 AD, Attila succeeded to the Hunnic throne.
Attila comes in at that point when the whole Hunnic body is working as one, and he is the big man who is able to control the lot.
Just how powerful a leader was he?
For 20 years or so, he was probably the dominant character in the whole of Europe.
As the Huns grew ever more powerful, the Romans were in decline. Their empire was now split in 2, with the wealth centered around Constantinople to the east.
Attila the Hun, legendary warrior king, found dead the morning after his wedding.
I think Attila was murdered, and I think that was a plot that was hatched right here in Constantinople.
The princes in the Tower of London vanished, presumed murdered, by King Richard III.
It seems extremely likely that they have been put to death.
And medieval noble Juan Borgia, victim of a mafia-style hit that helped inspire The Godfather.
Acts of violence required retaliations, bloody retaliations.
It's the wedding night of near-mythical warrior king Attila the Hun, arch-enemy of the Roman Empire. His new bride is Ildiko, said by Roman chroniclers to be a great beauty. To celebrate, Attila feasts deep into the night, sharing toasts with his fellow Huns before retiring to bed.
It was a prime target for King Attila.
He was organising a protection racket, really. He was threatening particularly Constantinople. And if the Romans didn't pay him what he asked, he would simply attack.
Attila was a constant threat and a massive drain on Roman resources, costing their treasury over 10 tons of gold in payoffs. Much of this gold was melted down for Hunnic jewellery. But today, the Hungarian National Museum hold coins which make the Roman source clear.
Wow, so look at these. So these are the proof, the evidence of the fear and the respect that Attila instilled in the mighty Roman Empire.
This coin hoard was found in Szikancs. It's in the Great Plain in Hungary.
Right.
And the total number was around 2,000 coins in one hoard. And we know it was minted under the rule of Theodosius II.
But the next morning, Attila does not emerge. When his anxious bodyguards burst in, they find his lifeless body and blood on the sheets. Who or what could have killed the most feared man on earth?
Attila's tribe, the Huns, arrived in Europe around 3 decades before Attila's birth. They came from the east and settled on the Great Hungarian Plain, just beyond the reach of the Roman Empire. I want to find out more about the Huns and their enemies. To help me on my quest, I've enlisted archaeologist Professor Barry Cunliffe.
Barry,
hello, Joe. Hello. Nice to see you.
So just what happened when the Huns hit these plains 1,600 years ago?
The Huns established themselves as the bosses.